Speaker today. Um, so as many of you may know, or some of you wouldn't, Dr. David Patel is a residential visiting scholar at the Middle East Initiative at Harvard Kennedy School. His research focuses on religious authority, social order, identity, and state building in the contemporary Middle East. He is the author of a book, which he's going to speak about today, maybe amongst other things, called Order Out of Chaos, Islam, Information, and the Rise and Fall of Social Orders in Iraq. That was published by Cornell University Press in 2022. The book examines the role of mosques and clerical networks in generating order after state collapse and is based on independent field research David conducted in Basra in 2003 and 4, I think. And it won the Best Book Award by the APSA MENA Politics session. Before I hand over the floor to David, I want to briefly give a bit of background on how we found David's work and pull back the curtain a little bit of what we've been doing over the past year. So 2 years really. So as Stacy said, there's many strands to score. We're the religion and peace building strand, and like all the other strands, we've been doing or have done, speaking in past tense now, it feels good. I've done a systematic review of the literature in our field. We've been focusing on the qualitative strand, and there's a team at Uppsala that's doing the quantitative strand. So we've been doing the systematic review of religion and peace building, and I encountered this book early on in our search stage, and obviously was very intrigued by it. Fascinating argument, really cool methodology, but honestly, there was a bit of hesitation on whether I could include it or not. Where it got snagged, and where many publications got snagged that I found were so interesting, was up in one of our filters that, okay, it's religion, but is it peace building? Is it peace? Is that what he's talking about here? Or at least is it directly relevant to the conversations about post-conflict peace building? Many publications got cut at this stage painfully because you run a systematic review, you have to have parameters where we judge they were what we said adjacent to post-conflict peace building, as we called it. But this book survived that process. Um, and really why, I think, because it brought a new perspective to a lot of the theoretical conversations that we had found in this literature in terms of its theoretical perspective and the conceptual toolkit that it employed, namely this adoption of what I think David will talk about, rational choice theory, and the conceptual toolkit of economics that is quite prevalent in some other score strands. Um, but as I read this book and ruminated about and thought about, okay, is this a framework that can be trained on to our strand and complement a lot of the other very interesting theoretical conversations were happening? And I thought very much so, yes, it can. This question about how people in the anarchic environment immediately following state collapse as a result of armed conflict are able to organize, coordinate, and instill some semblance of security and order at the most local level, and the vital role of the mosque as a site of coordination in this process that David argues was salient in Iraq. And I think that's indeed a very interesting and relevant conversation for us and everybody interested in this nexus between religion and peace building. So I absolutely credit David's work in illuminating that for me and hopefully the rest of us in this call, and that will be able to watch this recording later. So just wanted to sort of situate the conversation a little bit. But now I'll hand it over to David. He's going to speak for about 20 minutes or so. It'll be an informal conversation after that. We'll hand it over for a Q&A, and then we'll finish at the top of the hour. So right at 4 p.m. if you're in the UK, but top of the hour. I know many people are across time zones. So David, over to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's an exciting project, and I can speak for hours. Like I could be like one of those guys at the United Nations General Assembly who riffs for hours and hours about Iraqi politics. So stop me if I'm going on too long. I'm happy to talk about Iraqi politics today. There's a lot of important things happening in Iraq with the election, renegotiation of the relationship with the US, so we can get to that. If you want to talk about the relevance of my work for Syria, Gaza, peace building elsewhere. But what I want to do is take you back to 2003 and 2004, right after the US invaded, because these issues of religion and peace building, at its core, it has to be social order, right? Local social order, then community building, scaling up to national level social order. And what I do is look at the relationship between religion and particular types of religious actors in the creation of social order, locally and then nationally. So the big puzzle of the book, I think, is why did Iraqis turn to religion after the collapse of the Iraqi state? And not just religion, right? Because turning to religion can mean lots of things. It could mean local religious actors, Husseinias, Sufi networks, political parties based in religion. It could be people of your same religion who aren't necessarily religious leaders, right? Sectarians aren't always secular. So the puzzle is why after the invasion did so many Iraqis in the first year or two turn to clerics, both local clerics, imams of their mosque, and then nationally, both Sunni Arabs and Shia Arabs turned to key religious leaders. We know about the Grand Ayatollahs of Iraq, most prominently Grand Ayatollah Sistani, but also a lower ranking cleric, Muqtada Sadr. But even among Sunni Arabs, some of the most important political entrepreneurs in the first year or two after the invasion were Hada Thovari, or the Association of Muslim Scholars, an organization that tried to coordinate Shia clerics after the Sunni clerics right after the invasion. The conventional wisdom is that it's natural in times of crisis or when things break down, people turn to, I don't want to say a primordial identity or some identity that's deeply seated, religious attachments. I argue that perspective, although there's some merit to it, it's either mostly wrong or at least incomplete. And the argument I make is Iraqis turn to religion not just solely because of the message of Islam, but because of the way Islam was able to deliver messages in a time when they needed to work with their neighbors after the state collapsed. So how are we going to get to that argument? Let's go back to 2003. Imagine you're a young, not even young, imagine you're an Iraqi right after the invasion. The Iraqi state collapsed almost overnight. It was raptured in some ways. The state was looted down to its foundations. And when I say looted, the Iraqi looters went in and ripped wires out of the wall. They took anything that could be removed from key ministries and government offices. So the Iraqi state, which wasn't as strong as it was before 1991, but clearly had been strengthened under the oil for food program of the United Nations in the late 1990s, early 2000s. It was a functioning state, a strengthening state, fiscally and administratively. It disappeared almost overnight. And in that week after the US invaded Iraq, trash started accumulating in people's homes, on the streets. Gangs ran rampant. Remember, Saddam had released all the prisoners from Iraq's jails just right before the invasion. And so Iraqis had to find a way to provide first local order before they could turn to any sort of national level peace building. And the argument I make is a new institution, and when I say new institution, Shias did not hold Friday sermons in the vast majority of mosques before the war. There's a long history of debates within Shiism on whether or not you can hold Friday prayers in the absence of the imam, but except for a brief period in the late 1990s in a small number of Shia mosques, most adult Shias in Iraq had never been to a Friday sermon. Well, right after the invasion, local preachers started for the first time Friday prayers. And what these preachers did is they stood up and said, we've got a lot of issues in our neighborhood. Here's how we're going to prioritize them. The trash is piling in our streets because there's no trash collection provided by the state, and it's going to take a while for the state to be reconstituted. Let's dump our trash in this empty lot 2 blocks down from the mosque and burn it. Now, you just live in this neighborhood. The trash piling up in your street isn't great. You might have a preference. You might be the person who lives right next to that empty lot. So you might prefer it to be dumped in another lot farther away. But this is an example of a coordination problem. It's an issue that you want to solve, and you'll solve it in a way if you believe that a sufficient number of other people will solve it in that way. So if everyone else is doing something, you want to do something. I argue the power of these preachers was because they had a unique ability to disseminate a message and disseminate that message in a way that everyone in a geographical area heard it and knew that other people in the area heard it. That's what game theorists call common knowledge. It's not just you know something, it's that you know other people know something. And these Friday mosque sermons, in the absence of a state, in the absence of other institutions that could provide common knowledge, I'm happy to talk about why there were so few other institutions or organizations that could provide common knowledge. It's a legacy of Ba'ath authoritarianism. They had a unique ability to generate that common knowledge in the area and coordinate Iraqis on local level issues. So really local, in your neighborhood, in the catchment area of the mosque. And then each week, the preacher could address something slightly more complicated, right? First trash. And then people are driving through our neighborhood really fast. Let's create speed bumps. And then maybe have a night patrol. And then let's discourage people from coming to our neighborhood and shooting guns into the air, which is really common. And then they could gradually ratchet up. So even if they had some pre-existing authority, it got ratcheted up week after week after week. But their authority of these preachers was limited. And that's, I think, the power of one of the, I think, most powerful aspects of the theory I put forward, this informational theory of authority, is that their authority was limited to solving coordination dilemmas, things that you want to do if you correctly believe that a sufficient number of other people want to do them. What these preachers were not able to do was get people to engage in actions that are subject to free riding, in which if enough other people are doing it, you have an interest in not doing it, right? A collective action problem. This is a common issue in political science. We in social sciences more generally. We talk about the prisoner's dilemma, free riding issues, but we tend to ignore coordination dilemmas. But coordination dilemmas, I think, are ubiquitous and much more important and much harder to solve than economists and game theorists have given them credit for. So the argument I'm making is that the authority of these preachers got ratcheted up week after week after week because they helped Iraqis, and Iraqis looked to them, not necessarily because they believed they agreed with the particular way they were solving issues, or they thought that preachers should be playing this role in society, but needing to coordinate with their neighbors. They began to expect their neighbors, who expected them, to jointly look to this disseminator of messages to solve these issues. Now, Iraqis were dealing with all sorts of issues at this time. How are you going to create a new constitution? What form of government should you have? Finally, a couple months later, an 80 or 70-some-year-old cleric at the time, sitting in Najaf, cloistered in Najaf, who had never before been involved in politics in any way, who most people didn't even know what he looks like, whose voice had never been heard, Grand Ayatollah Sistani, started issuing statements through his network of mosque preachers on what he thought about the political process. And so what happened is, just like locally, Iraqi Shias and Iraqi Sunnis at the time, they were using Friday mosque sermons to coordinate with their neighbors, provide local goods. The difference between Sunnis and Shias in this case is that Shias have a hierarchical network. Grand Ayatollah Sistani and Muqtada the Sadr to a lesser degree, even though he's not a Grand Ayatollah, he controls a fraction of his late father's network, they could coordinate messages across mosques. So if you were going to a Sistani mosque in Basra, you knew what tens, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Shias going to Sistani mosques in Amara or Kut or Baghdad were hearing on national level issues. Sunnis didn't have that same sort of structure, that hierarchical structure of clerics. And the Ministry of Religious Endowments was abolished. There were a couple competing organizations, which I mentioned earlier, who were trying to coordinate sermons, but they didn't have that internal network authority. So Sunni Arabs were less good at creating that inter-congregational common knowledge. But Shias, whether or not they realized it or not, were hearing what lots of other Shias were hearing, which led to the emergence of a imagined community, if you want to use that word, of Shias throughout the country. And this is how Sistani's authority then got ratcheted up. Somebody who had never talked about politics, who most Shias never expected to talk about politics, suddenly became a key voice for that community, even among Shias who didn't think of themselves, first and foremost, as a Shia politically. They wanted to solve these national level issues, and this was the best way they could know what their neighbors and other people, not their neighbors, thought about. And so I argue that first, that ability to solve local community action problems, that led to an increase in religious authority. But it also deductively restricts how far that religious authority could expand, both geographically, but also topically, what set of issues Sistani could get people to comply with. Sistani, just like the clerics under him, could only get people to coordinate on issues. He could not get people to engage in higher cost contribution issues. And so his authority was limited to coordination dilemmas, not collective action problems. Other perspectives on religious authority are not good at setting limits, right? If authority expands, and it usually doesn't, most theories don't tell us how authority expands, we just kind of assume it does, but then what are the limits of it? Sistani told people in told Shias in February 2006, after the bombing of a key shrine for Shias that provoked intersectarian civil war, don't retaliate against your neighbors. He was ignored. And Iraq descended into several years of pretty violent intersect conflict. So he was very careful not to say things from that point on that would be disobeyed. Because when people saw their neighbors or other Shia disobeying those messages, their belief that future messages would be obeyed went down. And so Sistani, just like all these clerics, learned after a period of experimentation what issues they could and could not be influential for. But his ability to coordinate Shias across the country created, as I mentioned, almost an imagined community of Shias where they could effectively seize the state and shape that post-war invasion process that served Shia interests, even if those Shias didn't want it to. Sunnis didn't hear those messages, either locally or nationally. And so for a lot of Sunni Arabs, it felt like the country was just solving issues without them. And a key issue in those first couple of years was this question of Sunni inclusion, the conditions under which Sunnis would join the political process. Well, from the get-go, Sunnis were divided. Some were joining the political process and participating in elections. Some weren't. Some were boycotting, staying home. Others were not staying home, were creating insurgency against this new political order. It's because they didn't have that national level message being delivered that would think of themselves as a group. And that's a key idea. We can call them a group. You can call any group a group. The question is, do they have a sense of we-ness? Just because you're a Sunni Arab or a Shia Arab, it doesn't mean you have a good sense of what other Shias think on issues that you haven't dealt with before. What is the Shia position on whether or not Iraq should be a federal democracy or not? You could ask the same thing about Syria today. There's Druze, there's Alawites, there's Christians, there's Kurds. But do they jointly have a position on what the role of Islam should be in the constitution? No. And so what the power of Sistani's coordination feature was, people just wanted to solve these issues. And that's what most people wanted to do. They wanted to solve these issues so they could have peace, so they could have economic prosperity, so they could get on to issues that would affect their daily lives. They just wanted to solve it with a sufficient number of other people. And that ability to coordinate messages across sermons allowed them to unify a significant number of the people who I don't think naturally would have thought of themselves as Shia. And sectarianism, I therefore argue, emerged as a really salient cleavage in post-invasion Iraq, inadvertently, as the accumulation and as the unintended outcome of lots of individuals relying on this particular message, in particular messengers, to coordinate with their neighbors and with other people throughout the country to solve these issues. And so it's very much an informational level theory. It's very functionalist, right? Extremely functionalist, very rational choice, very information-based. And so it's not incompatible with religious arguments. I should say it's a particular type of religious argument, but it's not incompatible with emotional or other arguments for why people turn to religious actors. But I think it is very powerful in explaining a lot more people turn to the mosque and religious actors than we would have expected. Iraq was widely considered the most secular, or one of the most secular countries in the Arab world. So explaining not that 10% of people, but why a huge segment of the population, both Arab Shia and Arab Sunni, turn to mosque preachers of all religious actors. I think you need a good explanation for that. And then something that can tell us the limits of that authority. Topically, geographically, I think is really important to make sense of post-invasion Iraq. I will say that political, and I'll end on this, and I'm happy to talk more about any aspect of this. That political system that was created in post-invasion Iraq, it turns 20 years old this year, right? 2025. It was created in 2005. There were 2 elections in 2005 in January, February. you can say what you want to say about that post-invasion political system that was created under occupation. It still stands. It is shockingly resilient. And when I say shockingly resilient, it has survived intersectarian civil war. It has survived intrasect civil war, when Shias were fighting Shias, when Sunnis were fighting Sunnis. It survived 8 years of a Venal prime minister and Prime Minister Maliki. It survived the withdrawal of US troops. It survived Iraq being the site of proxy conflict between the US and Iran. It survived the collapse of the Iraqi army and the rise and fall of ISIS. It survived a Kurdish independence referendum. It survived Iraqis storming the Iraqi parliament twice. It survived a sustained protest movement. It has survived militias being there. And throughout that time, Iraqis have held 6 parliamentary elections, each of which was inclusive, competitive, and consequential. Consequential in the sense that Iraq has now had 7 prime ministers since 2005 and has actually had real changes in government. And changes in government in the sense of the Dawa party gave up power to a rival. The Shia Islamists gave up power in 2020 to Kadhimi, who is somebody who isn't from the Islamist camp and actually in some ways was a challenger to them. So you've had real changes in office, in relatively peaceful changes in office, which is quite rare for the Arab world, right? And so I'm not making a direct link to the resiliency of the political system, but I am saying that political system that emerged during that period where Iraqis had to create social order for themselves as a new state, the institutions of state were created. It also led them to coordinate on a political system which is extremely corrupt, which doesn't serve the needs of its people, but which today is probably the most democratic country and the most democratic political system in the Arab world. And I'll defend that point. Not saying it's a democracy, but I'm saying it's a low bar, still probably the most democratic country in the Arab world. So let me leave it at that. I'm happy to talk about any aspect of this or its applicability to other situations.
Okay, thank you, David. That was fascinating, and I wish we did have hours to talk about this. I could listen to you talk about it much, much longer. So we'll open it up for a Q&A now. Feel free to use the chat function as well. I'll keep an eye on that and read them to David if you'd prefer to put it in there. Um, I have many questions, but I'll be a polite host and let the floor go first if anyone wants to jump in. Yep, go ahead, Michael.
Well, thanks, Thomas. Thanks, Stacey. Thank you so much, David. That was absolutely fascinating. You know, if I nipped in at the end without hearing the beginning of your talk, I probably would have thought you were speaking about Lebanon, because the same resilience is certainly there. But I thought what you had to say was fascinating. A couple of perhaps rather obvious questions. Um, is there a comparison? Is there another case that springs to mind in which this phenomenon would be obvious? And you mentioned Islam at the beginning, and maybe the message of Islam, but from what I took from your presentation and conclusions, I mean, would I be right in thinking that it wouldn't make any difference? The same phenomenon would be observable given the circumstances in Iraq and the vacuum, if it was just different Christian factions that were dividing up the spoils and being forced into this new system. Yeah, those two things. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So there's a couple things there. One is the compare. So I think any reason. So if you the first class you take in comparative politics, right? You talk about concepts and stuff. So we teach our students there's different conceptualizations of democracy. You can have a maximalist, polyarchy definition where it's all these civil rights that have to go along with it. But there's also an argument for a minimalist definition of democracy, which is about competitive elections and changeover in power. If you take a minimalist definition, and I'm not saying that's the only one that's defendable, you're right. Iraq and Lebanon, I think now, since Tunisia is no longer an exceptional case, Iraq and Lebanon clearly are the most democratic countries on that dimension, on that criteria in the Arab world. The big difference between Iraq and Lebanon, though, is the budget of the Iraqi government is what, $130 billion? The budget of the Egyptian government is probably what, 90 billion? So I mean, there's a lot of patronage to go around in Iraq. And so the way Iraqi politics is work, after each election, there's months and months of bargaining. But what's really happening is those political actors are getting together behind the scenes and dividing up senior civil positions in the ministries and senior civil service to basically funnel contracts to parties affiliated with them, to block inspectors generals and things going on in these ministries that will follow that corruption. And so there's a lot more resources of the state to go around in Iraq than there is in Lebanon. And so at the surface level, they look different. But I think that the intra-group dynamics that are sustaining that are quite different. And that's because of the size of the Iraqi state and the resources flowing in and out of Iraq, both through smuggling and through, pardon the pun, pork, with contracting and things. So surface level similar, but I think that the equilibrium that sustains each is quite different. So great question. So Iraq was the difference between Iraq and some of the other cases is there was a functioning, Iraq was a failed state, but it was a particular type of failed state in 2003. And it's a rare type of functioning state. It was a state that collapsed almost overnight. And there was a functioning state in almost all of Arab Iraq right before the invasion. That's different than most failed states. Typically, when we talk about a failed state, it's a process of failure, right? And Rothberg and Dan Posner, others have mentioned this. And as the state weakens over time or is challenged in various ways, other forms of social organization and political organization emerge. Militias, groups, other insurgent groups step into the vacuum of the state, so to speak, and provide order. Or it's in places that never had a strong state to begin with. Yemen and Afghanistan are like that. There's parts of Afghanistan where the state was probably never relevant, right? Or if it was, very, very loosely. And so they've always had ways of providing order and mobilizing people, tribal networks, other forms of social organization. What was different about Iraq is that there was a strong state, and a strong state that prevented civil society groups or associational groups or challengers to the provision of local order. And so it was a rare case where it's not that everything that came before didn't matter, because it does. Right. And there was a history of rising religiosity in the 1990s and the faith campaign that does sow the seeds of some of this. But it's rare to find a place where the state collapses so suddenly. Libya, I think, is a good case. That's very similar. Libya is more similar post-Gaddafi to Iraq than, say, Yemen or Afghanistan for that reason. Syria, I think, is an interesting case as well. I mean, I think my sense, and I think we're all learning a lot about local government in Syria nowadays. My sense is that the Assad government had turned over a lot of functions of the state to local power brokers and local militias in parts of the country. And so the extent to which those have been co-opted into this new order or challenged by groups coming from outside, from Idlib down, to replace them, I think is an open question. But there could be some dynamics there. On comparison with Christians, you know, the key argument I make is that this ritual of having a Friday sermon, and it's not that people were getting together and praying together. So I'm not talking about civil society, people talking to each other, just discussing things and deliberatively deciding, here's how we should solve these things. This, once a week, they got together, they heard a message from somebody who was up on a podium or up on a minbar delivering the message, and they were hearing it in a way that they knew everyone else was hearing it. And once you realize that your neighbors were figuring out local issues based on that message, you then had an incentive to go to the Friday sermon, right? So it had this power to draw in people who were not otherwise pious or religious or inclined to listen to a preacher in any way on any issue. They suddenly found themselves doing, or at least in the eyes of their neighbors, following the recommendations, if you want to call them that, of the religious leader. So they were in some ways they were acquiescing to the authority. And that authority was just the coordinating power of that. So my question would be, do other religious groups have that ability to deliver messages in ways that render them common knowledge among a people that need to coordinate? And you may find that maybe religious groups have a power to disseminate that message in a geographically fixed area, like a church congregation. Or maybe they have the ability to disseminate it in a dispersed way, like Sistani did, but over issues of a network. And they can coordinate not in a geographical space, but in a dispersed way. So I think that other religious groups, and not just religious groups, we can think about this theory applying to other forms of social organization. But to me, it's really about information, and the control over information that was key. And that information flowed through a ritual that routinely and regularly. And that was important because it allowed people to expect when other people would hear a message and know with confidence that a sufficient number of other people heard the message. And so you can think about other ways to do this. So Netanyahu is going to give a speech at the UN either today or tomorrow. And apparently they're setting up loudspeakers throughout Gaza to disseminate his message. He's trying to create common knowledge among Gazans that all Gazans will, this is what I think the Israeli government's hoping. They want all Gazans to know that other Gazans have heard this message from Netanyahu. And we'll hear what he says. He may say, everyone rise up against Hamas right now. I don't think they will, right? Because even if you hear the message, that's insufficient. You need to believe that a sufficient number of other people having heard that message and act on it. And so Netanyahu telling everyone through loudspeakers, stand up and revolt, could be like me right now saying, everyone on the Zoom, stand up and do jumping jacks. See, none of you did, right? You all heard the message. It was common knowledge, but none of you believed that other people were going to do it. Or if even if you heard doing it, even if other people, even if Kay and Thomas started doing jumping jacks, maybe Michael and Stacy didn't want to because it's not a coordination, it's a costly thing. So maybe delivering that message to Gazans through loudspeakers, even if it generates common knowledge, it probably isn't going to lead them to rise up against Hamas or anything else, because Gazans don't expect other Gazans to act on that message. So the same thing would be true for church groups or others. Even if they have an ability to disseminate that message, why would people believe other people would act on that message? So those are, it's a complex way to answer your question, but I think it provides a framework to start thinking about it in a lot of different contexts.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of interesting issues there that I've encountered in the literature is this sort of the structural differences between hierarchical religions and more horizontally oriented ones that I've seen people talk about a bit at the high level, that some things we expect in happening within Islam or with Christianity is going to be very different in Buddhism, for example, that's very sort of dispersed and networked. But I wonder if I could jump in with a question. So I wonder if you can talk a bit about legitimacy. And I heard in an interview you did a few years ago, I was watching, and you spoke about this,
Oh,
the
what
role
did I
of
say?
legitimacy. And you were right. You said, and this is definitely my impression from doing this review of the literature, that legitimacy is often, and I think rightly posited as a very salient causal factor in why religious leaders are able to do certain things in these environments. But it's also often treated as exogenous, that it's something that's pre-existing or it's there, some have it, some don't. But what you talk about, I believe, is you show it's a result of an endogenous process where they develop legitimacy over time. So I wonder, could you dive into that conversation a little bit? And I think that would be so valuable to this broader conversation of the role of legitimacy.
Yeah, legitimacy is a really, really hard thing to get your hands around. In political science, I think my discipline, social sciences in general, we're really poor at thinking through legitimacy. And instead, it's this exogenous factor that's there. And it ends up being very tautological, right? They have legitimacy. How do you know they have legitimacy? Because people are following them, right? And that's kind of what authority is. So Iraq was a vacuum. But the thing is, it was a vacuum only in the sense that the state collapsed. It wasn't a vacuum in the sense of absence of voices. Post-invasion Iraq was a cacophony of voices telling people what to do, right? There were tribal actors, and the tribes are hierarchical. So you had leaders of the Fakhd or the Ashira, this high order thing, but also local leaders of a clan, or even all the way down to the level of a bait, telling people what you should do. Vote this, do that, provide resources for this. You had national level actors coming from exile back, both secular and Sunni, When I rolled into Basra in 2003, the first flag I saw was one I didn't immediately recognize. It was a flag from the old Qasim era that people were trying to revitalize. There were hundreds of political parties. Every government building, after being looted, was occupied by some group. There were lots of different religious actors, as I mentioned. So there were lots of people saying, do this, do that. We say legitimacy is when people actually start following that authority. And so you're right. I think the power of my argument is I never use the word legitimacy, or I try very, very hard not to use it, because I think explaining why people turn to an actor and how that legitimate authority expands their authority or gets people to follow their orders or recommendations on a larger set of issues, I think that has to be part of your explanation. It has to be part of your explanation in a way that isn't just tautological. Sistani is a great example. Sistani, before the invasion, honestly, Iraqis, I was there for months before he really started talking. And it's not until January 2004, especially January 15th, when he first calls out these large protests against the coalition, the CPA's plan to have an appointed caucus write an interim constitution. Until then, people did not expect Sistani to be involved in politics in any way. He comes from this tradition of quietism where clerics aren't involved in politics. He survived the 1990s when a lot of other clerics did not, right? Muqtada's father was assassinated. 2 or 3 other grand ayatollahs were killed under Saddam. So nobody expected Sistani, who had never issued statements on anything really political, 1 or 2 on Israel, Gaza. But I mean, right before the invasion, he issued a fatwa, which you'll never find on his website or any compendium that his people have put together on his fatwas and statements. He issued a fatwa saying not to cooperate with the coalition, with the occupiers or invaders of Iraq. So nobody expected him to become a prominent political actor, even his own followers, who religiously are muqallids or imitators of his religious authority. He's a marja taqlid, right? A source of emulation. Even they did not expect him. And I know hundreds of Iraqis who were followers of him in a religious sense. They expected him to stick to his traditional writ, which is transactions, religious affairs. A third of the questions he gets are about sex. I'm not kidding. They expect him to stick to those things. But suddenly he's issuing statements about elections and about what to do with looted goods and these kind of higher level political issues. So I think you need to explain his legitimacy as part of your explanation. And we don't do a good job of that in a non-tautological way. And that's what I try to do. I avoid the question as much as possible. But again, like am I a legitimate authority? I'm the speaker today. Stacy and Thomas have gone through a ritual where the context was introduced. And then Thomas introduces me and he actually like mentions all these Harvard, PhD. And so like I have been authorized in some way. But then I told all of you to stand up and do jumping jacks and no one did. So I'm a legitimate authority in some ways. I'm a legitimate authority to start talking and to keep talking, and you have to listen to me. You can't interrupt me. But I'm not a legitimate authority to get you to do these other sorts of things. That's how I like to think about legitimacy and authority. And it's a complicated thing. You don't get good theories about it, but I think in a particular context and situation, you can think about why the authority or legitimacy expands or contracts given various behaviors and people seeing other people react to that. Now you're regretting recording this, but go ahead.
No. And I think that's a good call to action. I absolutely agree with you. That would be there's a lot more to unpack there around this concept of legitimacy. If we all agree it's so important, then let's think about where it comes from, how it develops, and when and why it doesn't. Okay, so we go to next question. Go with Jaffer. It's good to see Jaffer. So Jaffer actually is he was an RA on the project last year, right? And actually was a big part of the work we've done so far in putting the systematic review together. So, hi, Jaffer. The floor
Hello,
is yours for
Thomas.
your question.
Hi, and thank you so much, David. Really fascinating talk. And hello, SCORE team. So I don't focus on Iraq, but I often go to this country because of my own special reason. So during my research, which is about Shia settlements in Britain, I came across a couple of documents when researching about Shia organizations here, for example, Al-Hui Foundation, and I got to see letters coming from the Secretary of State to one of the religious leaders of Al-Hui Foundation, appreciating his role. And London was the probably one of the important cities among Shias before the invasion, where the Dawa Party was here, Al-Hui Foundation was here. They were all campaigning from here. So, how do you see the role of transnational Shia Islam, particularly during before the invasion and post-invasion as well? The other thing I also wanted to touch, which you also touched about, and you're absolutely right about the hierarchy within the Shia Islam, and I think that's one of the key strengths within the Shia Islam that sustained it throughout the centuries. For example, Khomeini's, it's a great example in exile, but their wakil or representative in different parts, spreading their fatwas and statements across. But it's also an issue of polarization within the Twelver Shia community. And you rightly mentioned about Muqtada al-Sadr and the rift between other Shia organizations in Iraq. So how do you see this role of Shia networks, including Sistani, Ayatollah Fardullah, Muqtada al-Sadr, shape today's Iraqi politics? Do you see any positive, or are there more reasons for creating polarization within the Iraqi society? Yeah, so that's two questions from my side.
So there's there's a lot of questions there and quite different topics. Let me try to address some of them. So you're right. So the Al-Khawi Foundation, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, before Grand Ayatollah Sistani, he's the continuation of a line of clerics, and Abdul Qasim Al-Khawi was his predecessor, in some ways his mentor. Who there's a center that is not continuing as Marja'iyya, right? Because you can't do that. You can't emulate a dead Marja or source of emulation, but you continue a lot of the charitable works. And one of the reasons I'd argue, and I do in the book, why Sistani rose to be his successor is Sistani didn't challenge the Khawi Foundation. He told and there's a slight dispute between the different collection of sons of Khawi. He allowed them to continue their activities. And so that is one reason why the Taqlid went to Sistani instead of a dozen other students of Khawi or clerics in Najaf who were well positioned to basically be an alternative to Sistani. And Sistani faced challengers. Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr, Muqtada's father, is a good example. And his name is Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr. I didn't stutter. His name is Muhammad. His father's name was Muhammad al-Sadiq, and his last name Sadr. So you got to call him Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr. If you say Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr, you're talking about actually Muqtada's grandfather. Anyways, pet peeve. So you're right that a key part of the Iraqi exiles and the Iraqi exile community played a really important role in mobilizing the push to war, both in the U.S. and the U.K., but also in guiding that transition right afterwards. And they played a really important role, including my colleague at MEI, Barham Saleh, who's one of the leaders of the Kurds, but then later became the president of Iraq. Those exile parties played a particularly important role in organizing the exile community. And a lot of people blame sectarianism in post-invasion Iraq for the way they organized exile politics. And the argument that's often made is that they brought sectarianism in a sectarian apportionment, an idea that goods and political parties and power should be divided by Sunnis, Shias, and Kurds in some proportion to their population numbers. And so they brought that back to Iraq, and it was important. I will say that they played a prominent role, but it's important to realize two things. That Iraqi political system has brought in a lot of challengers to them, and a lot of them have disappeared into obscurity, right? The Islamic Action Organization is not politically that important. They're important religiously, but not politically in post-invasion Iraq. Most of those Sunni Arab actors that were part of that exile community have disappeared very rapidly. And new Shia actors have become the most important political actors. Iraqi politics today, in the last election, although probably not in this one because the Sadrs are boycotting, there were two large blocks, both of them led by Shia Islamists. One was the coordination framework, which are basically the Shia Islamists that are linked to Iran, right? Maliki and a lot of those so-called Popular Mobilization Front or Hashid militias, and then Muqtada Sadr, the leader of the Sadrists. They're both Shia Islamists, and they led each of these two big electoral coalitions. And then they each had some Kurdish allies and had some Sunni Arab allies. So the point is that unified Shia bloc that was so prominent among the exiles and that dominated Iraqi elections in 2005, it had split by 2010. In the last 4 elections in Iraq, in this upcoming election, its characteristic feature is a fractured Shia Islamist political landscape. So the vision those exiles had of, I think it in some ways it came true, but it also doesn't explain who has power in Iraq, because they don't. And this prime minister of Iraq, Sudani, who's probably going to, I mean, if there actually was an election for prime minister, although there isn't, like the party that wins the Iraqi elections usually doesn't get to form the government. But I think Sudani is going to be, I think he'll still be the prime minister after the election. I'm happy to talk about why. He's not from their camp, right? He wasn't an exile. In fact, I was in Iraq in April, I guess, in the Sully Forum when Sudani announced, he was there and he announced his re-election and campaign. And this was the U.S. had just started the first round of talks, really going on a tangent here. It just announced a new first round of talks with Iran and the nuclear program. Sudani's election, his speech didn't address that at all. It was all about local issues. He started talking about potholes in Baghdad and how many projects were behind schedule. And it really gives you a sense that Sudani, he wasn't an exile. He ran a lot of ministers, was acting minister, but he cut his teeth in 2003 and 2004 as the mayor of Amara, which is a really hard scrapple town in the south, and then governor of the province. He's Tip O'Neill. He knows local politics, and you get that sense. A lot of the exiles didn't have that. They don't know local politics. They weren't involved under the under the late Ba'ath period. Muqtada Sadr comes from a tradition that was, and so the exiles were really important early on, but I think it's moved on. On transnational networks, I'm happy to talk a lot about that. I actually think it's a big puzzle, and I'm writing a new book on this, that there's 2 centers for Shi'ism. If you want to be a Shia cleric, you've got to go to one of 2 places, Najaf or Qom in Iran. That's it. That's actually really puzzling, because historically there were lots of other places where you had religious authority cluster, where you had grand ayatollahs and you could be trained, right? In Iraq, Karbala, Samarra, Kazimiya, Hilla, if you want to go back in town. In Iran, Shiraz, Mashhad, Tabriz. But elsewhere, El Bahrain, broadly defined, southern Lebanon. Heck, it was clerics from southern Lebanon and the Hausa there that were brought to Iran in the 1500s and convert Iran to Shi'ism. Why isn't there a Hausa in Lebanon? And why aren't there Maraja Taqlid? Why don't you have grand ayatollahs in London, in the US? There are 20 to 25 million 12er Shia in India. Why isn't Lucknow a Hausa that's doing Batha Kharij training? Why don't you have grand ayatollahs there? Why don't you have grand ayatollahs in Pakistan? There's 20 to 25 million Shia there. I think that there is transnational leadership coming from Najaf and Qom and Sistani and Khamenei. But and this is what my next book is on. I snuck it in there. We need to explain the continuation of that legitimacy and that authority, right? It shouldn't be taken for granted that Najaf and Qom are the main centers of religious authority. In an era of nation states, why has religious authority among Shias remained so transnational? That's a puzzle that has to be explained. It's not natural. So look at Sunni religious authority. It's highly fragmented across countries, and all these countries have developed their own. There still is Al Azhar, but there's national level religious leadership and training and networks. For Shias, it's remained transnational, and that's puzzling to me. And I think that has to be explained. And buy the book when it comes out.
We'll have to have you back and do this again when that next book comes out. That sounds
hopefully
fast.
not in 20 years. Hopefully this one will be faster than the last one.
Okay, so I think we'll have time for one more question. We might go over a little bit, but I think that's okay. No problem if people have to bounce off at the top of the hour. As long as you're okay, David, for one more question. All right, Stacy.
Thanks, David. This has been really brilliant. Really appreciate it. I have many questions I could ask you, but I think that the one question I want to ask you is about the religious generativity of this moment. So it comes out of a religious innovation of the Friday prayers, and it's not just about organizing people to pick up the trash. It's also they also managed to get people together for a religious and a spiritual encounter. You know, we can argue about to what extent people actually pick that up, but how do you see Iraq after this period of time and the spiritual dividend or religious generativity that was the outcome of this moment?
Yeah, so one thing I argue in the book is that, you know, Iraqis just needed to solve these local level issues, and they ended up turning to these mosque preachers. But those preachers were selecting there's a lot of different ways you can solve a coordination problem, right? This is the classic battle the sexes game or whatnot we teach students. They solved it in ways that they liked, and they imbued that with religious norms and language, and that permeated Iraqi society. And not just permeated Iraqi society, it created conditions under which people who otherwise would have been uncomfortable with pictures of Shia clerics on every corner. Saddam's picture was on every intersection, right? Those pictures were torn down, and they ended up being replaced with Shia clerics, living and dead ones. It created an atmosphere in Iraq where these images permeated your daily life. And I got to say, for Arab Sunnis and for Christians, it felt pretty threatening in some ways, and it felt alienating. I think for some of them, it felt like their country was being occupied, or at least was very rapidly shifting in a direction that they didn't understand. And so, yes, it was a moment, but I think my theory also explains how that moment allowed other behaviors and basically a public sphere that was very religious in ways that a lot of people acquiesced to, but didn't necessarily approve of, and certainly didn't approve of privately, but also contributed to sectarianism and divisions in Iraq that the vast majority of people did not want, and were resisting at the time, but were unable to because of the outcome of their behaviors aggregating up. So I think there is a legacy there of that turn to religion that I tried to argue was positive in many ways. It created order. Things would have been much more chaotic without it. But also has a legacy that was there for a long time. But it also shouldn't be overstated. I mean, this is going to reveal how old I am. But like 2003, 2004, this is before the iPhone was invented, right? The Iraqis didn't have internet. There were people didn't have television. Didn't have satellite dishes. It was banned under Saddam. Immediately after the invasion, all of these things flood the Iraqi market. The first thing people who had money did was go out and buy a satellite dish for like $70 or $80 at the time, and then put it on the roof. And then suddenly they went from having no television to having like 180 stations. Now the media landscape is vast. Every political party and every movement has their own radio stations. Cell phones are everywhere. The internet is everywhere. For many Iraqis, the internet means Facebook. So people are getting messages from all sorts of places, and the ability of any actor, a Friday Sermon or others, to like dominate the landscape in dominating the information sphere, and critically tell people, deliver messages in ways that other people know, that a sufficient number of other people they want to coordinate with have also heard, that's been really fractured. And so there's a legacy of it, but I don't think that legacy is that same mechanism operating today. Because I think Sistani's messages just don't reach anywhere near as many people as they did, despite him using that same mechanism. And I don't think Iraqis expect other people to act on those messages the same way. Like everywhere, it's fractured, right? What we're hearing and the zones of reality or spheres of reality we live in are shaped by who we think we're in contact with. And so that religious, that's one way to answer the question. Right, the legacy of it over time. But I will say Iraq, a lot of things were prevented under Saddam, a lot of public expressions of piety, a lot of Muharram and Ashura, things that were really important emotionally for Shias. And those are ubiquitous now. Husseinias are all over the place. The role of these in public life are really important. And there's other people who are doing excellent work on this. I mentioned Marcina Shamari at Boston College. She's doing excellent work on processions and the role of religion in everyday life. A lot of other scholars, Fanar Haddad's book on sectarianism in Iraq, there's a lot of people talking about the extent to which this is contributing to sectarianism or not contributing to sectarianism, and what sectarianism even means. There's some excellent work being done. But you're right, that that religion is everywhere now in Iraq, like it is elsewhere. But what it means for people and its mobilizational ability, the ability to get people to act in unified ways, has changed over time. And I think information and distribution and control of information is one way we can start to make sense of that in this and other contexts.
Yeah, fascinating. The role of TikTok and social media going forward, if we'll start seeing the imams getting on TikTok, etc. But yeah, that was absolutely brilliant, David. Thank you again so much. I wish we could do this for hours, but we'll look forward to that next book. So Stacy, did you want to close us out?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to say, on behalf of the Center for the Study of Divided Societies, the Department of War Studies, and of course SCORE, thank you very much, David, for joining us today. That was really, really fascinating. And especially, I mean, you were there in Basra in 2003 and 4. I mean, this is, really interesting to connect and hear your experiences about that. Thank you, everybody, for joining in for this summer online seminar series with SCORE. Watch this space. There will be more to come. But for now, thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, David. And we hope you all have a good rest of the day.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. David, can you just hang on?